Well, greetings on this 4th of July weekend, now the 5th of July. We're very glad to be with you from Cooperstown, New York, site of a busy National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Welcome, everybody, to the latest in our series of virtual programs. Today, it's the Virtual Author Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the Education Department, and we will be joined momentarily by author Luke Epplin. Luke has written the terrific new book, Our Team, The Epic Story of Four Men and the World Series That Changed Baseball. We'll talk about the book, but we will spend most of our time discussing the legacy of the great Larry Doby, Hall of Famer, and the man who integrated American League Baseball back in 1947. Before we get to Luke, just want to take care of a little bit of business. Want to remind you that this and all of our other online programs are brought to you by the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. They are our sponsor, and we do appreciate their support. We thank you, Ford Motor, for making these programs available free of charge. This is why we don't have to charge you folks out there, because of the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. Well, today, July the 5th, marks the anniversary of the great Larry Doby's debut with the Cleveland Indians. It came some 11 weeks after Jackie Robinson played his first game for the Brooklyn Dodgers. We're very glad to have with us today great author Luke Epplin, who has written the new book, Our Team, The Epic Story of Four Men and the World Series That Changed Baseball. Luke, freelance reporter and writer, has written for a number of publications, including The Atlantic and The New Yorker. We do welcome Luke to the Hall of Fame airwaves. Luke, how are you? How is your holiday weekend going thus far?
It's going great, Bruce. I'm here in Springfield, Illinois.
You were telling me a moment ago that you have been absolutely shocked at the reaction to this book. You're a relatively young guy, well, certainly compared to me by a long shot. We won't get into specifics on that, but this is something that has become somewhat of a sensation. It's one of the books that people are talking about in the summer of 2021. So you didn't see this coming at all?
I guess I didn't. I did not grow up in Cleveland. I am not an Indians fan. I grew up here in Central Illinois. I'm a Cardinals fan. So this story, before I really started to research it for this book, was completely new to me, and it wasn't something that I grew up with. And so I guess I wasn't aware of how resonant it would become.
Why did you become interested in this? I've done some writing myself, and I, like a lot of writers, I think I tend to write about teams and players of my youth, players that I saw. Obviously, you didn't see any of these players live. You've probably seen some highlights on YouTube and World Series films. Why exactly did this topic resonate with you?
It's kind of a long story. So my grandfather grew up in Southern Illinois. He was 4F during World War II, so he moved to St. Louis and worked in an airplane factory. At that time in World War II, St. Louis had two Major League Baseball teams, the Cardinals, who were usually pretty good, and the Browns, who were usually pretty terrible. My grandfather was an odd person in that he was a Browns fan. And so he used to hop streetcars after his shifts at airplane factories in World War II and go to Browns games at Sportsman's Park. So I grew up near St. Louis with kind of a greater understanding of the Browns than a lot of people had, because the Browns left in the 50s, much before I was born. And so I really wanted to write a book about the St. Louis Browns, and anybody who knows anything about the St. Louis Browns knows that the last owner of the team was Bill Beck. He did some of the sort of stunts that he's most notoriously known for now as owner of the Browns, with Eddie Goodell, the little person bringing him to the plate, bleacher managing, promotions, fireworks, the whole nine yards. And so that was kind of the thing to honor my grandpa. I live in New York City now, and in New York, the New York Public Library, they have bound editions of the Sporting News, which is the great baseball publication from early on. So I checked out Beck's earlier seasons when he owned the Indians from 1946 to 1949, and I was just sort of flipping through the Sporting News, almost reading it like a novel from in the late 40s. And when I was reading it, I kept noticing these names coming to the fore. Satchel Paige, Larry Doby, Bob Feller. And while sort of going through these things, I was noticing how all four of these men, Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, Larry Doby, not only sort of came together on the Indians, but they all seemed to represent a different facet of the integration experience that was going on at the time. You had Bill Veeck, who was more progressive, Bob Feller, who was perhaps a bit more of a traditionalist, and then you had Larry Doby and Satchel Paige, who were 17 years apart in age and sort of represented different generations of the Negro League. So I thought that you could tell a very full, rich tapestry of integration through these four individuals. So that's how I shifted and decided to focus on the Indians.
Luke, before we really get into the inner stories of the book, I want to talk a little bit about the cover.
Yeah.
Reminiscent of, I think, is it a Bowman baseball card from the early 1950s? Is that where it's coming from?
Yeah, that was kind of the idea. They wanted to make it look like a baseball card would look, at least on the top. Yeah. So the graphic designer went back to old Bowman cards and used, I think, similar fonts, particularly that R team at the top there. Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. Well, it definitely stirs up memories of that.
Yeah.
We want to remind folks that this book is available for purchase at our website. If you go to shop.baseballhall.org/ourteam, that will bring you right to the book, and you can purchase a copy of this book that is doing very well, both in terms of the numbers that it's selling, but also in terms of critical reviews as well. So once again, it's shop.baseballhall.org/ourteam, and that's a good way to pick up a copy of Luke Epplin's book. Luke, let's talk about Larry Doby with the Newark Eagles. Here is a photo of him, mid-1940s, very young Larry Doby. He's a second baseman with the franchise at the time. We know the reasons why Branch Rickey chose Jackie Robinson. Yeah, he was a terrific all-around athlete, but he was also a man of great character. He was highly intelligent, mentally tough, had military discipline. So we know all that. What were the reasons behind Bill Veeck pursuing somebody like Larry Doby, having to negotiate with F.M. Manley, the owner of the Newark Eagles? What was it about Dobey that so really satisfied, if you will, Bill Veeck in terms of this is the right guy for us?
Yeah, so Bill Veeck, when he bought the Indians in 1946, was thinking about integrating the club. He wanted the Dodgers to take the lead on that because he did believe that Brooklyn was the right place for the sort of initial pioneering experience to happen. But then he really did feel that if the Indians were going to be able to compete in the very competitive American League with the Yankees and the Red Sox and the Athletics and other teams like this, they needed an influx of talent really fast. And he knew that the quickest way to do that was through the Negro Leagues. He initially kind of followed Branch Rickey's blueprint in that he wanted to get players that were perhaps more toward the beginning of their career, that could have their best seasons on the horizon, could really be looking at potential. And Larry Doby, he found somebody like that had that in abundance. Doby comes from South Carolina. He went to high school in Paterson, New Jersey, and he was just a sensation when he was there. He was a four-star athlete. He was the captain of the football, basketball, and baseball team. He also placed in state and track. He was so well known in Paterson, New Jersey, that in his senior year, the school organized a testimonial dinner to him where poems were written about Dobey, music was sung about him. It was something that had never been done for a graduate of that school. And this is a school that was majority white, but it was integrated. And so Dobey, when this was important to someone like Veeck, Dobey had a lot of experience being on integrated teams and being sort of one of the lone African-American individuals on those teams. Like Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby was military trained. He got drafted into World War II, where he served in the Navy as a physical education instructor. And he was 5 years younger than Jackie Robinson. Robinson was 28 in 1947. Larry Doby was 23. He had led the Eagles to the Negro League World Series championship in 1946, where the Eagles barely eked past Satchel Paige's Kansas City Monarchs in a 7-game nail-biter. And then in 1947, Dobey just completely burst out of the gates. He hits a handful of home runs in the first week. He's just tearing up the league, batting over 400. And not only does Bill Veeck have his eye on him as the top young prospect, Branch Rickey is thinking of signing Larry Doby. If Veeck hadn't done it when he did, Dobey would have gone to the Dodgers. Rickey and Veeck were both high on him.
It's interesting. In some ways, Dobey actually made even more sense than Jackie Robinson.
He did, yeah. Robinson was somebody who had been in the national spotlight from his football days at UCLA. As you said, he was military trained. He was somebody that people knew. He was known not only among sort of black fans of football and baseball, but he was known among white fans from what he had done as a football player. He had had a year in the minor leagues, and he'd sort of come up at 28 as a sort of seasoned individual that would be able to perhaps withstand the slings and arrows that came from being a pioneer. Dobey, on the other hand, was just kind of pure potential, but he hadn't been known across white baseball as Jackie Robinson. Nobody knew who he was when he came to the Indians. And unlike Robinson, he did not have any time in the minors. It was just throwing him right into the fire.
Yeah. Now, Newark Eagles owner Effa Manley was not one to give up her players without compensation. What were the negotiations like between her and Bill Veeck?
Well, you have to sort of back up a little bit to 1946, whenever Branch Rickey is first signing players from the Negro Leagues. Rickey had a perhaps harsher view of the Negro Leagues than Bill Veeck did. He kind of believed that they were somewhat of a racket that didn't have very firm contracts. And so he did not feel the need to compensate the owners whenever he signed players. And so one of the players that Rickey signed into the 1946 season was Don Newcomb. He was a 19-year-old pitcher for the Newark Eagles who was supposed to factor in heavily into their rotation that year. Effa Manley, if you go into her archives of letters at the Newark Public Library, is confused about what's happening. She doesn't understand why Don Newcomb is not returning her letters, talking to her, and it's kind of heard through the grapevine that it's because he is signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers organization. And she is enraged that Rickey not only didn't tell her that, but didn't even contact her. In July 4th game in 1946, Effa Manley confronts Branch Rickey, who is in the stands at one of the Newark Eagles games, looking at her players and saying, "You better not sign any more of my players or I can make trouble for you." And so she is somebody who really believes, quite rightly, that Negro League owners that had found, developed, scouted, and helped along these talented players deserved compensation for that. And Bill Veeck was somebody who knew of the Negro Leagues. He grew up in Chicago, which is kind of the nerve center of the Negro Leagues at the time. It's where the East-West All-Star game happened in the Negro Leagues. He was somebody who could appreciate the sort of talents that were in there. He had a greater understanding of it. When he comes to Cleveland, one of the writers for the Cleveland Cologne-Post, which is a black newspaper, says that they are amazed not only that Veeck can name the players in the Negro Leagues, but he can tell you what positions they play. He can tell you statistics. He is somebody who really understood the richness of the Negro Leagues, and he also understood that he didn't want to sort of sign these players by what they call raids. He wanted to negotiate with the owners and compensate them for these players, which is what he did with Dobey.
What did he give up to the Eagles?
He gave up initially $10,000 to sign the Eagles. Effa Manley balked at that and came back to him and said, "You know, Mr. Veeck, if Larry Doby were white, he'd be worth at least $100,000. And so Bill Veeck unilaterally upped the offer to $15,000. He would pay the additional $5,000 if Larry Doby stuck with the Cleveland Indians for more than 30 days. Effa Manley still felt that was quite a paltry sum for somebody as talented as Larry Doby, but she was kind of in a vice grip there. If she did not accept that offer, and it leaked out that Larry Doby could have had a chance to desegregate the American League, and Effa Manley stood in her way, she thought that writers from black newspapers would have, told her that she was standing in the way of this pioneering player. And so she felt that the negotiations were very one-sided, that it was kind of a lowball offer, but at the same time, she was happy at least that the precedent had been set, that that a major league owner had compensated a Negro League owner for signing one of the players.
Now, it's interesting. Dobey was not an outfielder, at least not primarily an outfielder in the Negro Leagues. He was a second baseman. Did the Indians view him that way, or did they feel we're going to have to move him off that position?
I think that initially the signing of Dobey was a little bit sort of slapdash. I think that that what they thought about Dobey at first was simply that he was the most talented player and he checked all the boxes that they were looking for in terms of being young, being military trained. He was married, all of these sorts of things that were important to white executives at that time whenever they were scouting for talent in the Negro Leagues. When he comes to the Indians had just traded for Joe Gordon, the great second baseman from the New York Yankees. He'd come back from the war and had a very poor 1946 season. They thought that a change of scenery could have helped him, so Beck traded for him. So there was very little opportunity for Dobey at second. There was no opportunity for Dobey at shortstop, where Lou Boudreau was the great player manager of the Indians. Ken Keltner was at third, which was his kind of position for more than a decade there. It seemed that only at first base was Dobey going to be able to work out. Dobey had played a little bit of outfield in high school, but he certainly hadn't played it at a higher level. And so there wasn't sort of an idea that they were immediately going to shift him out there. It was kind of unclear where he was going to play whenever he came to the Indians.
More a case of great talent. We'll figure out what to do with him later.
Exactly. That is exactly it.
You mentioned a moment ago, and I find this very interesting. Beck chose not to send Dobey out to the minor leagues when he signed him in early July of 1947. Instead, he brought him right to Cleveland, basically used him off the bench. Why do you think that was the case?
I think that there is a confluence of reasons for why that was. One that certainly can't be discounted was that many of the Indians farm clubs at that time were spread through the South. And Beck was worried about sending Dobey down there as the lone black player in these organizations. The Indians' main AAA club was in Baltimore. And at that time, Baltimore was kind of notoriously hard on black athletes. And so there was also trepidation about Larry Doby being sent there. But I think also it fits right into Bill Beck's personality. He said quite often during this time that he wanted to sort of zoom the Indians from a sixth place team to a championship club. And he wanted to do it as quickly as possible. He simply didn't have enough patience to sort of wait for minor leaguers to blossom into major league stars. He wanted to remake that team fast and on the fly. And so he told Wendell Smith about maybe 2 weeks before Dobey signed that the way he was going to do integration would be almost like ripping off a Band-Aid. It would not be to send a player down, get the season in spring training and in the minor leagues. He said instead, one of these days, whenever the Indians take the field, there will be a black player wearing that same uniform, and you might not even realize it. And it sounded fantastical at the time, but basically that's what happened. Dobey was signed the exact day that he played his first game.
Yeah. I believe he came off the bench that day, right?
He did. So it was Dobey was played one last game with the Newark Eagles on Independence Day of 1947, July 4th. He hits a home run in his last game, but he also kind of commits several errors, and he's very nervous. His mind is not there in the Negro Leagues. He's thinking about what's going to become of him. He runs after the game to Newark Penn Station, where he catches an overnight train to Chicago, where he's going to be meeting up with the Indians who are playing the White Sox there. So he arrives in Chicago around 9 or 10 in the morning on July 5th, 1947, 74 years ago today, immediately takes a taxi. They pick up Beck. They rush to the stadium. Dobey signs, and within hours, he's in a Cleveland Indians uniform. It is a complete shock to his system. He said that during the sort of first 10 or so times he came up to bat as a member of the Indians, he could not stop his teeth from chattering. It's like he didn't have time to sort of process what was happening and sort of this major life change that is coming to him. And neither did the Indians teammates have time to process the desegregation of their roster. They were also sort of unsure of how to handle this new thing that was happening. So it was perhaps not the best planned thing that Bill Beck had done. And at the end of the season, he would even admit that.
Yeah. Dobey ends up playing very sparingly for the Indians throughout the balance of the 47 season. He appears in only 29 games, comes to bat 32 times, bats just 156. So in many ways, it was a real struggle. He doesn't play much. When he does play, he's not especially effective. Did this get him down? Was he frustrated? Or was he able to look at the longer term picture?
Well, there's one sort of important thing that happens during this season that I think we have to understand. Dobey does pinch hit his very first game with the Indians. The next day, the Indians play a doubleheader against the White Sox. Lou Boudreau, the manager, in the second game, puts Dobey in at first base to start. And at that time, the Indians had two individuals from Texas who were sort of trading time at first base. One was an older individual named Les Fleming, and one was a younger individual named Eddie Robinson. Eddie Robinson had just spent several years in the minors. He'd spent some years in the service, and this was basically his chance. He needed to, stick with the Indians if his major league career was going to amount to anything. And he'd really struggled that year. And he went into Lou Boudreau's office about a week before Dobey came, and he said, I don't understand why I'm not getting more playing time. I need it in order for me to get consistent. And Boudreau had assured him, you are our first baseman. You are a first baseman now. You're the first baseman for the future. Don't worry. And whenever Dobey comes onto the team and suddenly he is getting slotted into first base, Eddie Robinson is furious. He can't believe that now he has more competition. He quits the team on the spot. He says, well, fine, if Dobey's going to play, then I'm no longer going to be on the Indians. He doesn't come up for the game. He's in the locker room. And it really takes Bill McKechnie, who is one of the main coaches on Lou Boudreau's staff, to go down to him while the game is going on and say, Eddie, you don't want to do this. People are going to think you quit because Larry Doby is black. It's going to hang over you your entire career. Please rethink what you're doing here. And so he does go back to the Indians. But because of that, there's kind of a lot of Indians start grumbling to the press. A lot of Indians feel like Dobey is taking away time from them. A lot of Indians are sort of unclear as to what Dobey's role even is and why he hasn't, as they said, sort of paid his dues, even though he did in the Negro Leagues, but they think that he should be in the minors. So they all sort of rush to Eddie Robinson's side. That is the only game that Larry Doby starts all of 1947. Lou Boudreau said he was going to start him more, but I think that basically you saw there what could have happened if Boudreau continued to give him playing time. There would have been kind of a mutiny almost on the team. So after that, it does seem like Dobey gets relegated to the bench and he's unable to settle into a groove. He is so frustrated at the end of the season that, and lonely, quite frankly, he's the only black player on the team, that he thinks that the Indians are just going to release him. He goes to Bill McKechnie at the end of the season and says, am I even going to make it on the Indians next year? And McKechnie says, Larry, you have a good chance, but you're going to have to learn the outfield because there's no room for you on the infield. And so that's whenever it's planted in his head that he's going to need to move into the outfield.
Well, that's intriguing what you just said, because what I read, it may have been something you wrote, may have been something someone else wrote. The expectation was that Dobey was not going to make the Indians roster in the spring of 48.
Yeah. Well, the Indians in 1948 carried 8 outfielders on their spring training roster. And I believe that there was sort of room for 5 to 6 of them. Out of those 8 outfielders, everybody assumed Larry Doby was last. I mean, just the idea that Larry Doby was going to make the team seemed fantastical after how nervous and sort of out of place he looked in the previous year. And Dobey, in fact, was so inexperienced in the outfield that he spent the offseason in Paterson, New Jersey, where he lived. He was going to the library and checking out books that said how to play the outfield. That is how little he knew about the outfield. But he comes to spring training and he's just a completely different person. Like within the first week, he is just killing the ball, just hitting home runs, tearing around the bases, really showing the athletic ability that made him the number 1 prospect in the Negro Leagues. It's almost like the athlete that the Indians did not see the previous season because he was so sort of thrown for a loop from what had happened. And so within a week of Dobey being there in Arizona, Lou Boudreau is giving interviews to the press where they're saying, is anybody sort of surprising you or you feel good about it? And he's immediately saying Larry Doby.
Mm.
He's like, I think the quote that he gave to the Cleveland press at that time was that the difference between Dobey of this spring training and Dobey of last year is like the difference between Bob Feller and the greenest of all baseball rookies. It was just night and day. It was a totally different person, but he still had to battle his way onto the roster. And it wasn't until the last day of spring training that he finally secured it.
It really was a transformation. He becomes an outfielder, their primary center fielder at one point. He ends up batting 301. He actually received consideration for the MVP award at the end of the season. I was going to ask you, to what do we attribute all the improvement? Was there a coach or an advisor along the way? But based on what you're saying, this basically came from within. This was Dobey transforming himself.
I think there's a lot of factors involved. During spring training, Tris Speaker, the great Indian center fielder of the past, is hired as a sort of coach down there, and he really kind of looks at Dobey and sees. I think the quote that he gave to the Sporting News later in the season was, "This is the sort of rookie I've dreamed my entire life of having." He just could immediately recognize that this man is my, heir out there in the outfield, and so he really works with him. Bill Veeck, at the same time, too, is an incredibly supportive owner of Dobey at the time. Dobey would later say that when Bill Veeck could kind of sense that he was getting down or sense that he was going into a funk or something was bothering him, he would take him out to dinner. They would go listen to jazz. He just kind of showed the support that Dobey needed at the time. And it was still a really rough road for Dobey during that first month of the season, whenever the Indians still could trim their roster down by mid-May. There is every expectation that Dobey was going to get trimmed. He was committing a lot of errors in the outfield. He would have games where he would hit a mammoth home run and everybody would just have their jaws on the floor. And then he'd strike out 5 times the next game. It was almost like kind of a roller coaster ride of ups and downs. And so Boudreau was thinking that Dobey could sort of use a little more time to sort of smooth it out. But every time Boudreau was ready to send him down, Dobey would do something, whether it's a catch or a home run or something, where Boudreau would just be like, I just can't do it. Like, I think Boudreau's phrase to the press was, "I don't know what he's capable of, but I want to see." Like, he needed to find out. It was just the talent was so overwhelming. But at the same time, Dobey is dealing with so many of the issues that he was dealing with the year before. There was not a tradition of black and white players rooming together. So Dobey often roomed alone. In some cities, he could not stay in the same hotel as his teammates, so he was sent to segregated accommodations. He was dealing with massive amounts of loneliness. He talked about when he was on the Eagles, after games, if you had a bad game, if you struck out, committed errors or whatever, you could be with your teammates, you could talk it over, or you could just kind of, forget about it, just through their camaraderie and through their support. But he would go back to his hotel room and be alone by himself. And he would just sit there and think about it and sort of feel his difference during this time. The racial abuse that he suffered was tremendous, coming from fans and from players alike, and even from some of his teammates at times. It wasn't, some of them weren't necessarily hostile, but there was a sort of coldness that he was dealing with in the locker rooms. And so he was not only learning the outfield and not only trying to stick on the team, but dealing with these burdens that his teammates did not also have to deal with.
Here's a famous photograph of Larry Doby with Jackie Robinson. I'm not sure in terms of the context where this was taken. I'm guessing it's an all-star game. That's just a guess. Let's talk a little bit about their relationship. And I do want to get more into some of the racial issues that Dobey faced, because we don't talk enough about that. He faced a lot of the same racism as Jackie. But let's start with their relationship. Were they close? Did they become friends, or did they just not cross paths all that often?
They did become friends. Whenever Dobey joins the American League in 1947, Jackie Robinson writes a column of support in the Pittsburgh Courier, saying that he is so glad that Larry Doby is here, because now he doesn't feel that if he makes a mistake or does something wrong, that everything, the weight of the entire the weight of all black ball players is on his shoulders, that someone else is there with him. Dobey talked about several times in interviews throughout his life how in those nights, whenever he would go back home or to a hotel by himself and sit there, he would call Jackie Robinson and they would talk on the phone, because these were two of the only people that could understand what they were going through in the major leagues. And Dobey would later say that he really felt like it's through these conversations that they kept each other from not giving up or not becoming too down. So they were their own support system at this time. The Indians and the Dodgers did cross paths during the 1947 and 48 season, where they played exhibition games. I believe that the Indians played the Dodgers twice in 1948. The last time that they played, which was in, I believe, either late July or early August, all four Black players, Robinson, Roy Campanella, Satchel Paige, Larry Doby, shared the same field together. And there were more than 65,000 people that came to Cleveland just to see this exhibition game. And they say that 1 out of every 6 Black residents of Cleveland was at that game. Wow. So this was tremendously important for the Black community to see these players playing against each other. And apparently one time, whenever Jackie Robinson whenever Larry Doby got on base, he and Jackie Robinson were talking so much that whenever they tried to pick him off, whenever the pitcher tried to pick off Larry Doby, Robinson didn't even see him and the ball hit him in the chest. So these were men that certainly did keep in close contact with each other.
Yeah. So we think the photo here was taken in one of those exhibition games?
It is very possible. Yeah, I don't know the provenance of this particular photo, but there are some great photos of these two together during the exhibition games from those years.
Now, there's no question that Dobey faced many of the same problems of bigotry that Robinson did. There's a great interview that Dobey did with Jet magazine in 1978. We'll read the quote from it. "Jackie got all the publicity for putting up with racial abuse, but it was the same thing I had to deal with. He was first, but the crap I took was just as bad. Nobody said, we're going to be nice to the second Black." And that's a direct quote from Larry Doby, Jet magazine, 1978. Luke, tell us about some of the specific incidents that Dobey had to go through, whether with teammates, opponents, fans. What are some of the worst problems that he had to endure?
Well, first of all, just in terms of that quote, Larry Doby often said that his road was, if not as hard, perhaps even harder in some respects, because Jackie Robinson being the first, being in New York City at that time, and having that spotlight so much on his back, in a way kind of like made it so that anything that happened to him got publicized to a great degree. And so in a way that might have, I don't want to say insulated him, but it did sort of provide a spotlight for Robinson to sort of talk about it. Whereas Dobey at that time was in Cleveland after the sort of, excitement of him getting signed. The fact that he then sort of sat on the bench quite a bit caused the media not to focus so heavily on it. And so, but it wasn't like it wasn't there. It just wasn't as perhaps nationally publicized as some of the stuff with Robinson, but it was certainly as bad as others. Dobey was introduced on the team whenever he signed with the Indians in 1947. Lou Boudreau took him around to shake hands with people. Several teammates refused to do so, including some, they said, even turned their backs to him. When he goes onto the field in 1947 for his first game against the White Sox, the Indians pair up to throw a ball back and forth. His teammates conspicuously kind of freeze him out, and he's just kind of standing there by himself among the fans. It's an image that really stuck with him. It kind of felt like an eternity for him being out there. Whenever they were in spring training, he was unable to stay with the Indians at their same hotel. I think some of the worst times were after spring training was over, but before the season started, they barnstormed across the South with the Indians did with the New York Giants, and they would play at sort of little towns across the South on their way back to the respective cities. Dobey had to play in Lubbock and Texarkana and places like this. A lot of times he was unable to accompany his teammates on their way to the hotel and on the way to the game, had to find his way there himself. The guards refused to let him enter at a lot of places. Taxis refused to pick him up. Fans were throwing bottles at him to the point where at one point Lou Boudreau had to pull him from a game. Just the sort of isolation that he was dealing with at the time was quite bad. During the 1948 season, in a game against the St. Louis Browns, Dobey almost snapped and ended it. A fan from the stands talked about his wife in a very vulgar way, and Dobey momentarily lost his head. He grabbed a bat and tried to climb the fence. And luckily, his Indians teammates saw what had happened and pulled him down onto the ground and basically said, "You can't do this. Like it's going to end it." And so you can only imagine how often Dobey heard things like that from the crowd.
Luke, my interpretation has always been that Jackie, for all the difficulties he faced, he was thicker skinned. He was a fiery guy, maybe not as sensitive as Dobey. Dobey was kind of a quiet, introspective, very sensitive person. So maybe in some ways, well, it was difficult for both of them. Maybe in some ways it was even harder for Dobey. I may be completely wrong, but I'd like to get your perspective either way on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of characterization of their personalities is pretty accurate. Jackie Robinson was somebody who perhaps lashed out, whereas Dobey burrowed in whenever he received any sort of slights or anything like that. I talked to one of Larry Doby's high school teammates, a guy by the name of Al Kachadurian, and he, spoke the world of Dobey as an athlete, but said that the crowd often, whenever they were at these games, would do things like chant Amos and Andy, or the players would sort of, put an extra knee in Dobey's back whenever they tackled him on the football field, things like this. And Dobey never retaliated. He did not sort of, try to fight anybody or anything like that. But Al Kachadurian said that Dobey would just kind of burrow into himself. And there'd be times where he would just withdraw. He wouldn't talk. You could try to talk to him, but he would not answer you. He would just kind of go into his own world where he needed to sort of recenter himself, and then he would come out of it. You saw this whenever Dobey got drafted into the Navy. He boards a train in Newark, New Jersey. He's going to Chicago, which is where the Naval Training Station is. And on the train, there's white recruits and there's black recruits. And Dobey's looking at everybody and thinking, we're all going to the same training base. We're all going to be together. And he recognizes some people. He's like, I played against him in high school. I recognize him, all this sort of stuff. And so he's thinking, we're all going to be together in the same place. When they get to Chicago, the white recruits are immediately separated from the black recruits. And Dobey just kind of said, this was the first time that segregation just really punched me in the face. It's, he'd had to deal with it his whole life, but this was so starkly done, and it was his country that it was doing it to him, that he said that he just went into his shell, as he said, and it took him a long time to get out of it at the Navy. He was quite quiet, and people said that he didn't like to leave the base with people. It's kind of almost a recovery period that he had to go through. Yeah. And so, Dobey was very sensitive and thin-skinned, but also I think that people at that time misunderstood him. Like, if you read interviews with Dobey, he's talking about the racial abuse that he's dealing with. And a lot of times interviewers are just saying, well, why don't you get over it, or something along those lines? And they're not listening to what he's saying. And so it must be quite frustrating for him to have to try to sort of explain why this stuff is so difficult for him to deal with, and not having the sort of mainstream press even make any effort to try to see it through his eyes.
We know that with the Dodgers, Jackie Robinson had his ally, his good friend, Pee Wee Reese, who really helped him. Was there anybody like that for Dobey with the Indians?
Absolutely. Yeah. Joe Gordon, the second baseman, was perhaps the best ally that Dobey had on the Indians. By that time, Joe Gordon was in his mid-30s. He had been an MVP. He'd been to war. He was a mature man. And he, unlike some other players who, even if they were indifferent to integration, were sort of worried about what some Southern teammates might think if they became friendly with Dobey, Joe Gordon had no hesitation with it. He would sit with Dobey on the train. He would sort of counsel him from the bench. Lou Boudreau was kind of overwhelmed, being the manager and a player at that time, an MVP player at that time, that Joe Gordon was really kind of the one that would go around to the teammates. It's almost like he was almost like a secondary coach for Boudreau, and kind of lift people's spirits, talk to them, get them out of their funks and things like that. But Dobey also said that Bob Lemon was a tremendous help to him. Jim Hegan, the catcher, was a help. And in terms of coaches, Bill McKechnie really was instrumental with breaking through to Dobey. Bill McKechnie is the one that Dobey sought out after 1947 to try to get to feel whether he would even be coming back. After bad games in 1948, Dobey would seek out Bill McKechnie to talk things over. They would often sit together on the train. He was very helpful for him.
You mentioned Lou Boudreau. Did he and Dobey get along pretty well?
Dobey would say later in his life that he wished that Boudreau had modeled better behavior about. He felt that Boudreau did not do all he could to make Dobey feel both comfortable and as an accepted member of the team. He thought that Boudreau remained a little bit too neutral. It wasn't necessarily that Boudreau was hostile, but he felt that Boudreau was a little bit too neutral and did not sort of openly embrace him in a way that could then sort of show the other teammates, this is how we're going to be handling the situation. So I think Dobey did have his qualms with Boudreau.
Boudreau was still pretty young at that point, if I recall correctly, and I wonder if the youth caught up with him there.
I think it did, and whenever Bill Veeck bought the team in 1946, bought the Indians, he told Boudreau in no uncertain terms that I really think you're the best shortstop in the game, but I don't think you're the best manager in the game. And he was continually trying to sort of talk Boudreau into ceding the managerial responsibilities and then just focusing on shortstops. And Boudreau told Veeck that, hey, if I can't manage, then I'm not going to play shortstop with you. And so Boudreau was really trying to sort of fight for his professional life. And so you add integration on top of this. And I imagine that Boudreau thought, oh my gosh, this is just another thing that I'm going to be having to deal with. So you can definitely see him kind of relegating that more to Joe Gordon rather than facing it as head on.
Certainly one of the peaks of Dobey's career, his performance in the 1948 World Series. He actually played better or hit better in the World Series. He hit .318 and was one of the main reasons why the Indians defeated the Boston Braves 4-2. And there's that famous photograph, that embrace between Dobey and a white teammate, Steve Grommick. And I know you talk a lot about that in the book.
Yeah, Dobey comes into the World Series on quite a hot streak. Through September, I think he had a 21-game hitting streak at one point, and then followed that up with another 10 or 12-game hitting streak. He's really coming into his own. And in the World Series, he leads all Indian starters in batting average. And in the fourth game, with the Indians up 2-1 in the series, Dobey hits a home run off of Johnny Sain that proves to be the game winner. And Steve Grommick was somebody who had been kind of a back of the rotation starter, somebody who would, maybe start the second game of a doubleheader. Boudreau unexpectedly gives him the start in that game. And so it's the biggest game of his career. And he pitches out of his mind. He has an incredible game at that time, but it's still not quite good enough against Johnny Sain. And it's really Dobey's homer that puts him over the top. And so when he comes into the clubhouse after that game, he sees Dobey, who has given him the gift of this victory that he might not have otherwise had, and just kind of wraps his arm around him in a spontaneous hug. And, photographers caught him at that time. And the thing that I find most poignant about that is that it did go across, newspapers. It was an image that was really instrumental in terms of civil rights and all of that sort of stuff. But for Dobey personally, Dobey would later say of that photo, that was the first time that somebody on the Indians showed his emotions to him. In other words, that was the acceptance that he had been wanting since he joined the Indians. Somebody to just kind of treat him sort of unselfconsciously, as you would treat anybody else. And so it's both a beautiful image and in some ways kind of sad for Dobey to have to say something like that.
Yeah. I didn't include the photograph in the PowerPoint, which I should have, but it is in the book. People can actually take a look at it. And you see the smiles on both gentlemen, and it's pretty legitimate, pretty sincere. It's clear this was not a staged photograph for press. I mean, this, as you said, was spur of the moment, and it was genuine.
Yeah, Yeah, and that's what makes it all the more special. And in fact, a lot of Black newspapers wrote articles not only about the photo, but of the spontaneity of the photo, which makes it all the more special.
Yeah. We've been spending a lot of our time, most of our time, talking about Larry Doby because today is the 74th anniversary of Dobey making his major league debut for the Indians, officially integrating the American League in the 20th century. But I do want to talk about some of the other key figures, three other key figures that are all profiled, prominently featured in the book, Our Team. And Luke, let's begin with Satchel Paige. He joins the Indians in 1948, also coming over from the Negro Leagues. He and Larry Doby now become roommates. On the surface, you might think they became great friends. Really not the case. They apparently clashed a bit.
Yeah, it's almost an irony because Dobey is leaking to Black reporters sort of constantly through 1947 and 1948 that he really wants a roommate. He needs somebody that he can talk to. He needs somebody that he can sort of go through these issues that he's dealing with as the lone Black player on the Indians. But what he gets instead is, quite frankly, a legend, somebody that is old enough to perhaps even be his father, and somebody who there's a generation gap between them. And so the thing that he is pining for the most ends up being the thing that doesn't end up really helping him. He says that Satchel Paige often was not in their hotel rooms because he knew everybody from his travels in various cities. And so he would just sort of meet up with friends or go stay with other people or things like that. And also Larry Doby did not like the way that sort of Satchel Paige carried himself. Paige often used humor to diffuse racial situations. Paige often sort of walked rather slow and had a deadpan demeanor that certain white individuals could interpret as almost like a step and fetch it stereotype. And Larry Doby thought that was a little demeaning and not the sort of dignified manner that he wanted to project as a pioneer. So these two, in fact, just did not get along.
For those who might not be familiar, Step and Fetch It was, I believe, was it a 1930s or 40s television character?
A movie character. Yeah.
Movie character. And we look back on it, it's, pretty stereotypical, pretty much racist.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it was done for comedy back then, but we look at it now and really it's obviously not funny.
Yeah. And it was something that in Paige's generation, white fans kind of, liked it was a stereotype that they thought of sort of Black players. But Paige, to his credit, he would sometimes almost conform to it. But then once he got onto the mound, he would just blow down the batters. And so it wasn't like he was any sort of, his performance did not suffer from it one bit. Once he was on the mound, he was all business. And he would even say that in interviews, that pitching is a serious business and I'm a serious pitcher. And he meant it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's talk a little bit about Satchel Paige and Bob Feller. Here we have Paige joining the Indians. He's primarily a reliever at this point, very effective, but a reliever, only occasionally starting. He's a former Negro Leagues ace. Bob Feller, one of the Indians' aces, not in his prime at this point, but still very effective after World War II. Yeah. What was their relationship like, Paige, Feller? They actually knew each other going back several years, so I'm guessing they did get along.
Their relationship was more financial than anything else. Bob Feller grew up in a farm in Iowa. He was a complete baseball prodigy. His father recognized the talent in his son from a very early age, and he cleared off a piece of their pasture and built him a baseball diamond right there. It was essentially the field of dreams. Bob Feller makes the Indians at age 17, and his very first major league start ever, he ties the American League record in strikeouts. 4 starts later, he ties the major league record in strikeouts. He's so popular that his high school graduation is broadcast from coast to coast on NBC radio. What I find most interesting, though, is that when Bob Feller comes back from the 1936 season as a 17-year-old now phenom that everybody kind of knows, Satchel Paige is sort of barnstorming through Iowa at this time. And they say to the sort of baseball promoters are like, well, this is a dream matchup. Satchel Paige, who's already kind of a legendary figure, and Bob Feller, the new phenom from Iowa. Let's face them off against each other. And so these two men are linked from the beginning of Feller's career. They go 3 innings that night. I believe that Feller strikes out 8, Paige strikes out 7. They are 0-0 whenever they leave the game. And so there's this sort of thing where it's like you have the best sort of white pitcher of that time and the best black pitcher of that time. And they recognize not only would the competition be great, but their matchups themselves could generate quite a good gate receipt that could line their pockets. And so they really use one another to not only, duke out who is better, but also to fatten their bank accounts. And so these were two men who were extremely entrepreneurial at the time. They were business-minded individuals, and they recognized what could be done together at that time.
So they barnstormed against each other pretty much every winter, right?
Yeah, they did. And the big barnstorming tours in particular were 45, 46, and 47. 1946, Bob Feller comes back from the war. He's lost about 4 years of his prime, but also 4 years of salary. And so he's thinking to himself, to make that back up, he's going to do this sort of blowout barnstorming tour where they go from coast to coast, flying in airplanes, playing in giant stadiums. He does it all himself. No promoters, no agents, no lawyers, only Feller, so that he can collect the sort of money and just keep it himself. And he knows that in order for this to be successful, he needs somebody to face off against, not only who is going to be good competitively, but who can also bring in the black fans that will sort of swell the gate receipts. So him and Paige go against each other just for weeks on end. It's really something.
You never had the chance to talk to Bob Feller for the book. You did talk to his widow, Anne, who sadly just passed away earlier this year. She passed away in April at the age of 91. She became a beloved figure in Cooperstown as well, continued to come here for years after Bob's death. This leads into our first question from the audience. This was emailed to us by Ron Norris. Ron wants to know, who was the most interesting person of all those you interviewed for the book?
Boy, that is such a hard question because, as you said, the 4 people in the book are Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, Larry Doby. And so out of that, you've got sort of Paige, Veeck, and Feller, who are larger than life individuals. These are individuals who almost know how to spin their own narratives into mythology. They're their own PR departments. They each write more than one autobiography in their lifetime. These are people that are sort of part of, Americana almost. But I found Dobey to be the most interesting of the 4 principal characters. He's somebody that never wrote an autobiography. He's somebody that did not like to talk to the press, but at the same time, his narrative is as fascinating and as sort of improbable as Bob Feller coming from the cornfields and setting strikeout records. I mean, Larry Doby came overnight from the Negro Leagues, and within a year, he's a World Series champion. I mean, you really are not going to find a better origin story than that. And plus, I should also add my own personal favorite is Effa Manley. Just to see what she was able to accomplish as a sort of woman at that time and the way that she stood up to the boys' club of professional baseball was extraordinary. She did not back down. She dished it right back to everybody. She was a force and somebody who was also underappreciated.
Was there an interview subject that was really the go-to person on Dobey for you?
In terms of an interview that Dobey had given in his lifetime?
No, maybe somebody, a family member of Dobey, somebody who knew him.
Yeah, I interviewed several people that gave me great information. I talked about Al Khachaturian, who was his high school teammate, which was great at that time. I talked to Jim Mudcat Grant, who unfortunately just passed away maybe a couple of weeks ago. He talked about going to spring training with Dobey. And I think the best story he told me was that he would be kind of in spring training with Dobey. They'd be rooming together, and Dobey would suddenly throw his shoes across the room, turn up the TV really loud, and start screaming. And it was just this sort of frustration that was coming out. And he told Mudcat Grant that whenever you are dealing with that sort of thing, that is how you handle it. You don't sort of show your teammates, you don't show the press, you don't take it out on the field, you do it like that. And so he said that Dobey could keep it sort of bottled inside of him, but then it would sort of burst to the front. But he also told me about how Dobey taught him where to go eat in Arizona at that time, which was still kind of a minefield for black players in terms of that, what papers to buy, where to go, things like this. He really mentored Jim Mudcat Grant to a tremendous extent, and you could see how important that friendship was.
Not a question, but a comment from Patricia Kirster. Just wanted to tell Mr. Epplin that I read this book in April and really loved it.
Oh, great.
Thanks for that. So we do appreciate those comments from Patricia.
Thank you.
Let's see. Another recommendation from Scott Blake. I'm a lifelong Indians fan, read the book and loved it.
Oh, good.
Highly recommend it to all the audience members.
Thank you.
Let's see. Alan Bronner wants to get an autographed copy of the book. So
yeah, well,
is there a website or a way to do that, Luke?
There's two ways to do that. You can go, you can email me, and if you just Google me and look at my Twitter account, I have my email address there in the bio, and I'll send you a signed book plate. But if you want an actual autograph on the book, go to AstoriaBookshop.com. That is my local bookstore, and I'm doing exclusively through them, signing every copy that is bought through them. So I'll just go to the store and sign the copies there.
And what's that website once again?
AstoriaBookshop.com. That's all one word.
Okay. Ryan wants to know, did Feller's views on playing with blacks change over time? Bob was a fairly conservative guy, but generally got along with other players on the team, white and black. Did his views change as he went from a segregated team to an integrated team?
It's a curious thing where Bob Feller was somebody who never had any misgivings about taking the field in barnstorming games against all black clubs. He was not afraid to get beat by these clubs. Satchel Paige beat him often on the barnstorming tour. He exposed himself to defeat quite a bit. He knew of the power of black players because, as I said, he lost to them quite often. But when he was asked during his playing days whether any players from the Negro Leagues could make it into the major leagues, he invariably either said no, or he would sort of talk about how he wasn't sure that they combined the right sort of combination of skills and mental toughness to be able to make it into the majors. I think that in a way, Bob Feller was somebody who really believed in this sort of American mythology of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps of, even you can look at his own story, somebody that sort of worked out on the farm, worked out with his dad, sort of put in all the hours he did, and then broke onto the Indians and had this sort of incredible breakthrough. And so he kind of looked at black players that hadn't done that and sort of, instead of seeing the sort of barriers and systemic hurdles that were there in terms of prejudice and segregation and stuff, he sort of looked at individual faults or something like that. He would even say Satchel Paige didn't have much of a curveball and that his changeup wasn't that good. And so maybe he wasn't a big leaguer. He was really someone who looked at the individual in that term. And so I think that was kind of a blind spot in terms of Bob Feller. But once Dobey and Paige were on the team, he wasn't one of the ones that seemed to object or quit the team or anything along those lines. So he was a complicated man who had a variety of views that didn't always sort of add up.
Interesting question here from Bob. I've read that Larry Doby had a tough relationship with Hank Greenberg, who became GM of the Indians. Do you know if that's true?
He did, and he wasn't the only one. Hank Greenberg, whenever Bill Veeck owned the team from 46 to 49, he sort of was the one that negotiated contracts, and he was really friendly toward the players. Bill Veeck really loved players and was somebody who was always looking out for their well-being. And in fact, probably, spoiled them to a degree. Like he would give them very generous bonuses and things like that. Was somebody who was always looking out like that. Hank Greenberg, I think, was a little bit of the opposite. He took over some of those responsibilities, and a lot of players said that, he would kind of look at their stats and be like, okay, well, you have a 20-point average that's better than last year, but look at that, your RBIs are down 3. And so he would be like, same salary. And, I think a lot of guys were really frustrated with him. And I think that Larry Doby in particular thought that Greenberg didn't take into account the sort of extra pressures that he had to deal with from being a pioneering player. And Greenberg would often say in interviews at that time that he didn't understand why Dobey, he had all the skills that he needed to succeed, and why couldn't he just kind of get over the mental hump in a way. Yeah. I think a lot of people thought that way. And it's what I talked about earlier, where they didn't see the total picture of what Dobey was having to deal with.
Did you ever have a chance to talk to Bill's son, Mike Veeck?
I tried. He unfortunately was having health problems with his daughter. And I did end up talking to Gregory Veeck, who is also Bill Veeck's son, as well as 2 of his daughters. And so I felt like that gave me a good sense of the Veeck family. Unfortunately, I never got to talk to Mike, and I'm sorry to hear about his daughter's health problems.
Yeah, she came here a number of years ago. She passed away, I want to say, about 2-3 years ago. She was not very old. I want to say she was in her late 20s, and we did meet her. She was delightful when she came here. She was just starting to lose her eyesight, and unfortunately was a debilitating disease that affected her health in many ways. Yeah. One final question. We recently had the anniversary for Larry Doby being the manager, being hired mid-season 1978. Yeah. Hired to manage the Chicago White Sox. He replaced Bob Lemon, his former teammate. The White Sox were not a particularly good team at that point. They didn't play very well for Dobey, just as they had not played well for Lemon. Yeah. Did you look at all into Dobey's time as a manager as part of this book?
Just a little bit, because my book stops in 1948. I do obviously mention it in the epilogue because Dobey is hired as a manager by Bill Veeck. And so Bill Veeck made Dobey both the second Black player in Major League Baseball and also the second Black manager in Major League Baseball, behind Frank Robinson, who had taken over the Indians job a little earlier. It seems like there was kind of a lot of politics involved in that, because Veeck gave Dobey a lot of patience and time to find his place on the field when he was a player. But Dobey could have used the same amount of patience and time to find his footing as a manager. But after that half season that Dobey managed the White Sox was over, apparently Veeck took him into his office and said, I really can't discuss this, but I have been sort of more or less kind of ordered to let you go. And I think that it was just kind of something that the organization wanted to have happen, and Bill Veeck was not exactly thrilled about it. So it was a little unfortunate that Dobey did not get the same patience that he had as a player, as a manager, and he never got another managerial position after that.
Wow. And Veeck was majority owner at the time, right?
He was. It is a very. I believe that you could read Paul Dixon's biography, which is great, and everybody should, of course, read it, on Bill Veeck, to get more insight into that. But apparently, Veeck said that he didn't really want to discuss it with Dobey because they had such a good friendship, and he didn't want something like this to ruin it. And it didn't. They were friends throughout their entire life. And whenever Veeck died, Dobey, whose own father had died whenever Dobey was quite young, said something along the lines of, I never really got to know my own father, but I hope he was someone as good as Bill Veeck.
We could go on for another couple of hours, but unfortunately our time has come to an end. As you can tell, based on Luke's terrific insights into Larry Doby, the book is great. It's Our Team, the epic story of 4 men in the World Series that changed baseball. You can see on your screen the link that will take you right to our website, and you can purchase copies directly there. We also do want to thank Ford Motor Company for being sponsor for this and all of our other virtual programs. Luke, this has been wonderful. We really enjoyed it. You've brought a lot of light into a subject that really has been criminally undercovered over the years, and that's the story of Larry Doby, the second black man to play Major League Baseball in the 20th century. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Bruce.
Luke Epplin, author of Our Team. We thank him. We thank all of you for joining us today. We also want to mention that Luke has an editorial op-ed in the Washington Post. I guess it just debuted yesterday. It's an opinion piece. It's time MLB celebrates Larry Doby Day. We certainly agree with that sentiment. We're unofficially calling this Larry Doby Day here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. But make sure you check out Luke's article in the Washington Post as well for more on the legacy of the great Larry Doby. Have a great day, everybody. Take care now.